Hello, friends. This is Unexplained America, and I'm your host, Lisa. And I'll just get the business out of the way, guys, like I've been doing. But please find me on all the social medias. So I'm on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. You can listen on all the platforms: YouTube, Spotify, wherever, Apple. So yeah, just listen and connect, and also just be watching. Working on new merch, and I do have an event I'll be posting coming up in May, and I'll be speaking at this event in Fort Smith. So I'm very excited about that. Watch for that because I was supposed to post today, and I'll be honest, I subbed all day today, and I'm really tired. Like, we went to a cake concert last night, impromptu. So anyway, I'm a tired girl. But anyway, uh I will be posting about that event. So, and I would love if you have anything to say. Just make sure to comment. Please leave a review, of course. 5-star, please. But definitely comment. I've had so many nice messages about my last episode, which was part 1 of the murder of Billy Joe Holder. And I love to hear from you guys, so definitely message me, email. You can email at unexplained. I'm like, what is my email? unexplainedarkansas@gmail.com. I haven't changed my email yet over to the Unexplained America. So you can reach me at the unexplainedarkansas@gmail.com. So yeah. So today's episode is, really like all the rest. I mean, it's a tough one, and I have a lot of feelings about this, like I normally do. I have a lot of feelings. You'll also have a lot of feelings, and you'll have a lot of frustration, just like I do. So it's really like all the cases and where there's just horrible murder and no justice. So yeah. So we're gonna dive into it. So on the afternoon of December 2nd, 1963, Nancy, and I'm going to say Zanone. I've looked everywhere for a pronunciation of the last name. And so some people, I guess, with the same last name, people say Zanone. Others, it's Italian and it's Zanone. So phony. I'm interested to see how this family says it. But I will say, like, my last name, if you look at it, it looks like Ponson. That is not how my husband pronounces our last name. He is Cajun, and that's just me and L, Ponson. So just food for thought. But anyway, so Nancy Zanone was viciously stabbed in her home in St. Louis, Missouri. She would pass away the following day, and her killer would continuously evade the law for years. And we'll get into all that. But right now we're going to go back. We're going to go back and look at Nancy's life before it was viciously taken by Joseph, and we'll get into Joseph. So Nancy was born August 22nd of 1935 in Missouri to John and Gladys Love. So her name was Nancy Love. That's so cute. And Nancy grew up, just like the name says, in a very loving household. She was very close to her younger sister, Joan. And from every appearance, her parents supported them, gave them lots of opportunities. In fact, Nancy was a very talented little girl, and this really reminded me of my own little dancer, but Nancy was a dancer. She began dancing at a very young age, and she would actually dance professionally with a group until the time she got married. So, and she was also kind of more like and this reminds me of Elle too, more like a talent that she didn't necessarily use all the time, but she was a very talented singer. So she could dance, she could sing, but a lot of people didn't even know she could sing. Like, that was more of like a hidden talent, and she was more comfortable with her dancing side. So she did the dancing a lot more. She would kind of surprise people now and then with like a solo. So that just sounds awesome. But her passion was dance, and she enjoyed doing that on stage. So Nancy's early childhood and elementary was spent in Overland, Missouri, which would have been fairly rural. I don't know about now. I've never been over that way, but would have been rural at that time. And it was about 14 miles northwest of St. Louis, like downtown St. Louis. And after World War II, I almost said W. Well, after World War II, Nancy's family moved into the city, like actual, St. Louis downtown area, to Chippewa Street. So that's where they lived. And during this time, the neighborhood was said to be just teeming with young families, lots of kids, lots of teenagers growing up in this area. Like it was just a really great place for everybody to mix and mingle. And it was a very like tight knit community there. So it was like a great place to live. In fact, Nancy, she moved into this neighborhood. She started to meet the people, and she would meet her husband in this neighborhood. And she would have only been maybe 13 or so, but she set her sights on a young man that was about 4 years older than her, named Don Zanone. And she was just in love. Like she loved him. She didn't hide it. Like she let everybody know, and she pursued Don. I mean, she was 13. He would have been 17. That's a gap. I mean, it's not a gap as you get older, but when you're young, it's like Don wouldn't have even looked at her. He would have thought she was a child. But, she was just like, oh, she loved that Don. So she pursued him, and kind of, later on, and she would tell people that she would one day marry him. Like she would tell everybody that. And she was correct. Like she was a go-getter. So Dawn, upon meeting Nancy, of course, as a kid, didn't see her as dating material, but she was a kid in the neighborhood. He would talk to her, she would talk to him. I think she hung out, where he hung out, and that was it. But in fact, they did not officially begin dating until Dawn was like a junior in college. And then at that time, Nancy would have been more like a sophomore in high school or so. So now on top of pursuing Dawn, though, like she didn't only pursue Dawn, but Nancy was very busy as a teen with, again, her dancing. And she did dance professionally with a group, and they performed all over Missouri, Iowa, Illinois. Like she traveled with this group. So during her dance career, it said that she got to meet her favorite singer and actress many times. This was a woman named Cass. I don't know how to pronounce this. Daly. I have no clue of this person, but I did look her up, and she was very famous. She was like a singer, dancer, but she was kind of famous for being like funny, like kind of a comedian. And she performed opposite Rosemary Clooney in like movies in the 50s. So look her up. Cass Daly, Daley. Now Nancy also met professional baseball player for the St. Louis Cardinals, Ken Boyer. I think that's how you pronounce it. You guys tell me. So this was a big to-do and something Don found really exciting, as he loved his Cardinals. Yes, I mean, if you're from St. Louis, live in St. Louis, you love the Cardinals. People here love the Cardinals. We don't have a professional baseball team, so like we in Arkansas adopt the Cardinals. So anyway, so Nancy, although a presence on the stage, it is said that she was kind of more reserved and quiet. However, like descriptive wise, people would say that she was the nicest, sweetest girl ever. Like ever. I mean, what a nice thing for people to say about you. That you were the nicest, sweetest girl ever. So she was just well liked. And she, kind of being more maybe on the reserve side, she preferred small gatherings to big ones. Like she just preferred one-on-one interactions than just big parties or big to-dos. Now, Don ended up joining the Navy. Like, so he went off to college and he joined the Navy. And during this time, he and Nancy's still in high school, they decided to keep like talking, but that they would see other people. Like he's in the Navy, he's gone. Like they evidently at this point, they weren't that serious. So they were like, we're going to see other people. Well, Don, when he came home, he really loved seeing Nancy and wanted to see her and would tell her that he's coming home. But there were a few times when he came home and Nancy was out on dates with other boys. I mean, hello, you weren't exclusive. You said you were going to date other people. So this probably prompted Don I mean, obviously, like, he was pretty smitten. It probably prompted him to get more serious about Nancy. But by May of 1953, Nancy graduated high school, and then she went on to work actually for a company called Sinclair Oil, and they sold heating for homes. And like I think her aunt and her mom, or not her aunt, her uncle and mom worked for the company. So she got on there. So she was kind of working. She's still dancing. And she did get the opportunity of her life to dance with the St. Louis Municipal Opera on the Muni stage. This was a highlight of her dancing career. Like, and if you know anything about the Muni, it's a big deal. And it was a big deal back then as a dancer to be dancing on that stage. Like, was awesome for her. So also during this time, her and Don, they're still talking. They're keeping close. Like, he's keeping, I think, closer and closer to her. They're visiting. There's letters. Like, she even went with his family to see him in Texas. Like, he was in Corpus Christi and his family was going to visit him, and she went with the family. Like, the Zanones loved Nancy. They were pleased by this match. And obviously Don too. So by 1955, Don was exiting the Navy, and he asked Nancy to marry him. And then they got married September 3rd, 1955, at the Fry Memorial Methodist Church. And a little side note, this church, I think, was built in 1905, but it actually closed in 2004. So, wow, that was a long time. They did honeymoon in Lake of the Ozarks. I think that was a given, especially at that time. And Nancy, she gladly gave up dancing professionally. Even though she loved to dance, she always intended to stop dancing when she got married. Like, getting married, having kids, like, that was what her dream was. So that was, so dancing, she was done with it. She did it, she loved it, she was over it. So she gets married. For a bit, she does continue to work for Sinclair Oil for a bit. And then Don got a job at the Skinner and Kennedy manufacturer, which made all sorts of items, kind of looked like for the office. Like, they did calendars, wall calendars, desk calendars, other items. So it said that Don actually worked for the company for his whole career. Like, that's amazing. Like, his whole working life. So they're together, they're married, they're both working. They move into an apartment on Miami Street in St. Louis, and this is really not too far from Chippewa, where they lived, as kids, where they met. So in that neighborhood. So again, working, married. They're very close with Don's family, and Nancy is super close with her sister Joan, who still lives close by. And Joan has now gotten married to a man named Tom. So her and Joan talk pretty much every day. Like, they're on the phone talking. They're hanging out on the weekends. Like, Tom is hanging out with Don. Like, they're very close knit this way. Now, Nancy is also said to be an avid reader, and I get that. And she also enjoyed Pepsi. Like, she wasn't a drinker, but she enjoyed Pepsi products. So if the people were having their beverages or beers or whatever, she was having Pepsi. So I thought that was interesting. I'm more of a Coke gal, but I'm off of that. So Dawn enjoys going to watch the Cardinals. Nancy did not. She was like, you go do that. I'm going to read a book. That was kind of her deal. So, little side note during this time. So Nancy's mom, Gladys, evidently gets hooked on prescription pills. I don't know what initiated it, but maybe something initiated getting prescribed these pills. And during this time and in the research, it just said it caused some family issues, with that. Yeah. So, and her parents evidently had kind of moved away so that they weren't as close. But I will say by 1963, and this will come up, like, Nancy's mom is very much in the picture. So I don't know all the ins and outs of that family dynamic, but it is said that there was some strain on, like, Nancy's side. But her and Dawn, and she was very close with Joan, her sister, but her, Dawn's family, the Zanones, were very close to them, like, lived close and all of that good stuff. So anyway, After a couple of years of married life, Don and Nancy moved right back over to Chippewa Street. In fact, their address is 4964 Chippewa, which they're called apartments. And they're said to be like a four family unit. And it's like a large brick building broken down into four family units. And they really look like to me like townhomes, or if this is New York, like a brownstone situation. I don't know. It's a little odd that we don't have that situation here. I think it's more or less just, it's St. Louis. It's the city that they're trying to get as many families, with space. So anyway, I will post like this home is still there, so I will post what it looks like. It does seem like they lived in the lower portion of the home. Like the home had a basement. This is kind of common if you're a Midwesterner or whatever. Basements aren't really common for the South, but they are for, in the colder areas. You need a basement. You got to keep those pipes warm. So anyway, it had a basement and it kind of had 2 stories above it. So it's kind of hard to tell if the family like just kind of lived up. I don't know. It looked like they lived like on the walk-in level, then another family lived upstairs, but all the families in the unit like shared the basement for laundry purposes. Anyway, we'll get into that. But I do think they lived in the lower part of these apartments. So, and like I said, I'll post so you can kind of see it along with me. So they moved there because they were starting a family. So Nancy had her first baby on February 2nd, 1958, and it was a little girl named Laura. And Nancy had a rough pregnancy, and Laura came 6 weeks early and had to stay in the hospital for a bit, but otherwise all was good. I mean, Nancy and Dawn were very devoted parents, doting parents. They were absolutely over the moon about Laura. A few years later, they had a son named David, who was born June 27th, 1961. And once Nancy became a mom, she did stay home with the kids. So she wasn't working at Sinclair anymore. She wanted to stay home with kids. So their lives together, I mean, this was a very idyllic situation, very 1950 situation. You had your very devoted working father and then a very loving, doting mom who wanted to stay home with the kids. And the 2 kids. And it was all very traditional, very nice, very quiet and solid, like just a very happy situation. Now, in November of 1963, on the 22nd, right before Thanksgiving that year, the nation, of course, was absolutely shocked and thrown into mourning over the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. And no less, Nancy and her sister Joan are in mourning. They're in shock with the nation. I mean, this is shocking. And evidently they were so upset about all this that it said that they were talking on the phone like every night about it, like just on the phone with each other. And really, sadly, not even, I mean, obviously they have no clue that their own tragedy, I mean, Nancy for sure, and then Joan, there's tragedy looming for them, but they're talking about, the assassination. So it's just wild to look at this from like the outside. So on Monday, December 2nd, 1963, so this was a Monday after a long Thanksgiving weekend, the Zanones had been celebrating Thanksgiving, but also kind of doing the normal thing and thinking, okay, now we've got Christmas. And I don't know about you, when Thanksgiving's kind of late, it kind of throws everything a little bit off or makes you feel a little bit like rushed for Christmas. I don't know, but like, you've got the gifts and the decorating, the whole bit. So Dawn and Nancy were kind of caught up in that. So on that morning, Dawn got up. It's a Monday morning. I'm sure he had been off several days with Thanksgiving. So he got up and got ready for work. And he left, about before 8 a.m. Now, Nancy was up and getting Laura ready for school. So Laura was a kindergartner at, I think it's Butter Elementary School. And this is still there, by the way. I couldn't find a pronunciation on their website, but they have an excellent online presence. They just don't state their name. So typically, Nancy's mom, Gladys, so again, what we just talked about, they're strained, but yet Gladys is there. Typically, Gladys took Laura to and from school. So, a little tidbit about Nancy, whenever she was dancing professionally and traveling, she was in a head on collision in a vehicle. And this, I mean, she lived, she didn't, I mean, luckily she came out unscathed, but it was extremely traumatic for her, and she would never ever learn to drive. And so Gladys would take care of that for Nancy. So she would actually take Laura, to school and back. So Nancy had David. So, Laura's 5 and in kindergarten, but David is 2. So that was super helpful. So yeah. And another little side note. So this is kind of weird. The weather that day, so this is December 2nd, like I said. The weather that day was unusually warm for December, in St. Louis especially. So it was 52 degrees. The average is normally 36 or cooler. So 52 degrees is warm for St. Louis. I mean, that would have felt really nice. So again, Dawn is at work, Laura's at school. That day it's reported that Nancy did talk to Dawn on the phone, like he was at work and she was at home. They talked on the phone 3 separate times that day. And the last time being 1 p.m. So that meant they talked 3 times between that morning and 1. Now, I don't know if that was like their norm. It seems a lot to me. And I will say, like, I mean, I don't know. I maybe called Errol once, like checking with him once a day while he's at work. I don't know. Like, I worked for a really long time as a loan officer for many years. I was so busy. Like, we didn't talk during the day. So, and now I'm just like, he's busy at work. I know he's busy at work. So I try not to bother him. I don't know. We just don't talk that much during the day, but I'll check in with him. But now we do have texting, but I don't even text all the anyway. I don't know if that was normal. I don't know what they were talking about, but they talked 3 times. So I thought that was pretty interesting. So, and again, it doesn't say what they talked about. Now it's afternoon by this time, and Gladys comes by the house and drops Laura off. And this is sometime between 2 and 3. And it's noted that Gladys leaves, like, out the front door. And again, I post these pictures on Facebook and Instagram, just FYI. So check that out. But she leaves out the front door of their home, and it's said that she leaves the door unlocked. And I'm sure because, like, Nancy was busy, like Nancy was working on laundry, and of course she has the 2 kids. So Nancy didn't lock the door behind her. I'm sure Gladys is thinking, okay, she's going to lock the door behind me. But it's also, it is St. Louis, but it's also, 1963. So I don't know, I don't know the norm with the locking of the door, but it was notated that the door was not locked. So again, Nancy's very busy. She's got the kids. She's been doing laundry all day, and laundry is a chore. It's a situation because the laundry room is downstairs in the basement. So she's going up and down, and she's doing the laundry and she's ironing and all of that. Because it is so nice outside, she decides to bundle up the kids and let them go play. There's like a small backyard for them to play in while she's doing the laundry, while she's finishing up. So now Nancy is in her apartment. She's ironing. And a young man walks up to Laura in the backyard, and the young man asks if her mom is home, to which Laura says yes. And then the young man walks around to the front of the home. Now, this is from Laura's perspective. So he gets to the front of the home. He rings one of the doorbells. Like, there's like 4 different doors. So there's 4 options. So he rings one of the Zanone's neighbors, a lady named Ethel Duff, answers, and the boy asks if there's been any mail delivered there by mistake. Like, this is his ruse. Just, hey, have you gotten any mail for me or whatever? She says no, closes the door, and he leaves, but he kind of watches for Ethel to go back inside the house. And then he goes back up to one of the other doors, the Zanone's door, and he rings the bell. No one answers. Nancy's busy. The kids are in the backyard. He then tries the door and finds it's unlocked. So he goes inside. He goes through the living room and the kitchen, and then it kind of goes into a back bedroom. And he's looking for money laying out, like he's looking for something to steal. He then hears footsteps on the stairs. It's Nancy coming up from the basement. He then hides behind a door. So Nancy is now upstairs, and this boy, this young teenager, jumps out at her. He has a large military grade knife. Nancy is shocked, startled. This is very crazy, unexpected. She goes to run from the boy. He's got a knife, and he's about her size. She is about 5'2", 5'3", 110, 115 pounds. He's similar to her size. And he lunges at Nancy with this knife. He stabs her twice from behind. He's scared, so he runs as fast as he can. After he stabs her, he runs away. We will deal more on him in a bit, okay? So Nancy is badly wounded. She staggers to the back of her apartment. She is shouting and crying out for a neighbor. She's got a neighbor kind of above her named Betty Thomas. And again, Betty lives above her. And Nancy's yelling for help. And Nancy collapses on, it's kind of the landing outside of her back door. So she's kind of you can imagine the kids are in the backyard. Here's the back door. She's yelling up to Betty, she's moaning for help. Betty finally hears Nancy's cries. So she runs into her. So she's in her apartment. She runs into her own kitchen and calls for the police. Then she runs down to find Nancy, and Nancy is now unconscious. Both kids have run up from the yard. This is a whole situation, a horrible, horrendous situation. Laura is crying. She says, "Mommy, please don't die." David is just, he's 2. He's upset. He doesn't even know what's going on. So Betty gets the kids to a neighbor named Margaret, and then Betty runs back to stay with Nancy. And can you imagine? I can't even imagine any of this. This is horrific, absolutely horrible. But kudos to Betty. She's doing what she needs to do. So, yeah. So first at the scene is a St. Louis police officer named John Colker. Now, he had heard the dispatch on the radio. He finds Nancy bleeding badly bleeding. He runs back to his car and calls for an ambulance. And we're talking, when we say call, this is a dispatch. This is a radio call for people that are very young. So he calls for an ambulance. Right after this, 2 more officers arrive, and it's an officer, Arthur Vonderhaar, and then an officer, Paul English. They have a stretcher, so they load up Nancy, and they put her in Officer English's cruiser and drive her over to the city hospital. Now there, a Dr. Melrod, I believe, I have a question mark there. Dr. Melrod notes Nancy is in critical condition. When she arrived, she is in shock and she has no blood pressure. And this is 3:50 p.m. And she's taken immediately to the operating room. So now in the meantime, obviously there's police all over this scene. And then there's police talking to the neighbors. Yes, there's a lot going on. The police called on at work. So the police are there. They called on at work and have to tell him Nancy has been attacked. She's not in a good way. So they asked Dawn, this is over the phone, for permission to interview Laura to see what she knows. Well, Dawn doesn't grant permission for them to ask Laura, but instead he requires them to put him on the phone with Laura and he will ask himself. So he does. He asks, what she saw, what she heard or whatever. Then he finds out. So Laura mentions a boy. So she just says an old boy came up to them. And so Dawn asks Nancy, okay, how old she thinks this old boy is. And she says the same age as Terry, who is Laura's, this is it says Laura's 14-year-old cousin, so it's a cousin to Laura. This helps clue the police in on the age of this person, of course. So after this, Don goes immediately to the hospital. However, they don't let him in to see Nancy. Like, she will be in surgery all throughout the night. Like, she went in right before 4 p.m. and she's going to be in like all night. They're going to work on her. So her father, John Love, states to the media, because the media have jumped all over this, that the best surgeons, worked on Nancy all throughout the night, and they pumped her with like 30 units of blood. Like, she had lost a lot of blood. Now, they did have to give Nancy, this was at the hospital, what they noted. So they give her a tracheotomy for her to be able to breathe. She has tubes inserted between her second ribs, then another between her eighth, like between her seventh and eighth rib, both on her left side. One tube was to pump air in, and one was to pump out blood. Now, very early the next morning, the police were told Nancy was conscious. And of course, they want to talk to her. So an officer, John Keeley, and an officer, Eugene O'Donnell, both from the homicide unit, they go to the hospital, try to talk to Nancy, but she is absolutely hysterical. And when they try to ask her any questions about who, what, where, all she could say was, "I don't know. God help me." So after this, finally, she can't help them, the police that is, but finally Don is able to see her and get in to see her. And he holds her hand and tells her he loves her. And she says the same, like she is able to talk to him for a few moments. And it's really unclear how long he got to be with her and got to talk to her. But by 5:15 a.m. on December 3rd, Nancy Love Zanone passed away. I mean, yeah. So that's tough. The coroner's report noted penetrating stab wounds near her left shoulder blade between the seventh and eighth ribs along the posterior axillary line near the back of her lower left side. And then it said a second stab wound penetrated her lungs and diaphragm, causing extensive hemorrhaging in the pleuria, which was thin layers of tissues that are to protect the lungs. That first wound caused, it was a laceration of the left subclavian artery and vein, which is under the collarbone. So cause of death listed on the death certificate was hemorrhagic shock, severe blood loss, which is severe blood loss, contributing cause penetrating stab wounds, and lays out the two different wounds like we've already gone into, and where they were made, who they were made by. This is all listed on the actual death certificate, by the way. Her listed under contributing factors to death section, it lists homicide. So it does list all of that, and we'll get into that. But during all of this, the children, they had been staying. So during all of this, the children had been staying with Don's parents. Don had to go to his parents and tell the kids what happened. And Don tells Laura and David that their mommy went to heaven. Laura cries, but says, "At least we have you, Daddy." And then Don cries. Nancy will be buried the very next day. The very next day at Sunset Burial Park. The kids will not attend the funeral. And Don will never speak of what happened to Nancy. He will never talk about it. He doesn't want to talk about it. He won't talk about the aftermath. The whole family of adults will really never discuss this in front of the children. Kind of, we'll circle back, but yeah, they don't discuss it. It was too devastating, and Don just felt like he wanted to protect the children. So this vicious attack on Nancy is absolutely alarming for the city. The media, like I said, is on it from the go, as are the police. The police are. So a Captain John Walsh of the St. Louis Metro Police was placed in charge of the investigation. On the morning of the 3rd, a night sergeant tells Walsh about an incident that happened on the 28th where a lady named Grace Munyon was stabbed. So Grace was walking just on the street, kind of near this area, and it was around 12:15, when a young man kind of lunged at her with a knife in hand and tries to take her purse. Now, in this struggle, she gets stabbed in her arm and shoulder, and the young man runs off. So Grace reports this, and this incident, this area that it happened to, was very close in proximity to Chippewa, and it was very kind of similar. So that's why this sergeant told Walsh about it. So Walsh then goes to talk to a sergeant, Feldmeyer, who was over Grace's case, and ask if there were any suspects. So he says yes. They're looking for a young man named Joseph Arbeiter, who is, quote unquote, a daytime resident burglar. The police chat about this, they kind of feel like Arbeiter is responsible for both, just the proximity and just the way it went down. They really felt like Nancy surprised a prowler who came into her home to steal. So they felt like this definitely sounded like Arbeiter. So that morning, a detective, Frank Shocker, calls Joseph, and his name is Joseph. I'll call him Joseph throughout this, but Joseph's school to look for him. And Joseph is 15, okay? So he calls over to the school, finds out Joseph is not there, and additionally, he hardly is ever at school. They call Joseph's mom, Wilma, and Joseph's mom has she's at work. She has no idea that Joseph's not at school. She has no idea. She doesn't know where he is. The police tell her when she gets off work to keep Joseph at home that night because they're going to come by the house to talk to him. In the meantime, Detective Stalker is kind of driving around, patrolling the neighborhood, like the Chippewa, like this neighborhood, and he spots Joseph standing on a corner not far from his home. He stops and invites Joseph to come, in with him to the station for questioning. He states Joseph's demeanor is nonchalant, like completely just blasé. Stalker gets Joseph to the station, and instead of connecting him to the juvenile court officers, which will be pivotal, he takes him in for questioning in general. And the policy really for the police, so kind of in their defense, their policy was they take, the juvenile straight in to talk to them, and then they question them, investigate everything, and then book the youth on a special form before turning the children over to the juvenile detention center. That's their normal way of doing things. Now, at the station, Joseph is questioned by Feldmeyer, and as his supervisor to Stalker. So Feldmeyer's the supervisor. He first only questioned Joseph about the burglaries. Like, he doesn't say anything other than about burglaries, which Joseph denies having any involvement in any burglaries. Then the officer asked what he had been doing on the 28th, and he mentioned he went to a movie that let out at about 11:45 at the Arthur Theater. This would have been the 27th still, so it kind of falls into the very early morning hours of the 28th. So they ask him point blank if he stabbed Grace Munyon. He then openly admits to stabbing her, but said he didn't think he could hurt her because of her large coat she was wearing. Feldmeyer then asked if he had been anywhere near the Zanone residence on December 2nd. He said he was home all day working on his models, like model cars. They then told Joe that they had information that he was seen walking on Chippewa on the 2nd. And the detective notes a reaction on Joseph's face. So they get a reaction and they keep on going. So they then tell him that they were going to bring in the witness who saw him on the front steps of the Zanone's home, which wasn't true. None of this is true. But this was just something that they would say they commonly used as this, they thought that it was under the law to use this. So the investigator noted noted Joseph registered an emotional disturbance momentarily. Joseph then asked, okay, if I tell you what happened, can I be turned over to my mother so I can go play in a basketball game tonight? And the investigators were like, we cannot promise you anything. Like, we can't promise, based on whatever you tell us, we can't promise what's going to happen to you. Why don't you just go ahead? And they say, get yourself cleaned up and get everything off your mind. That's what they tell him. So Joseph then proceeds to tell them, well, I might as well. I couldn't sleep last night. So in this kind of initial confession there, he says, I was in that house. The woman caught me in her house. I was scared, so I stabbed her and ran out. So this is what Joseph says about the incident with Nancy. And he tells the officer he left his home at 10 a.m., and they know that cannot be true. I mean, this incident does not happen until 3 p.m., so he's not going to be walking the streets for 5 hours. And he didn't state anything, in this confession, he did not state anything about talking to Laura in the backyard. And they didn't understand why he didn't say that, if he just didn't register that as an important detail or what, but he did not mention that at all. And then he says to them, at first, he was just knocking on doors in general on Chippewa. He also told the police first that he hid the knife he used in his garage, which, anyway, we'll get into that. So once Joseph confessed to the stabbing, Feldmeyer stopped the questioning immediately. Walsh, Feldmeyer, Stalker, like all these officers, took Joseph to his home, and they did call Wilma. They let her know what was going on. They asked her to meet them at her home, and that they had Joseph. And evidently Wilma didn't have a key to her house, because I guess the kids always beat her home. So the story kind of varies. Like, Wilma would say that the police went and got the key, but really it was, they say that Wilma went and got the key from her daughter at school and then met the police, there at the home. So either way, the point is they all went and met at, the Arbeiter's home. Now, the other two officers mentioned before, which was a Keaty and an O'Donnell, they had been at the scene. They came and met also. So once they were all together, Wilma asked the officers, what did Joe do this time? An officer tells, Joseph to tell his mother what he had done, and he doesn't. He won't tell her. But then they tell her Joseph stabbed the woman on Chippewa. At that time, Wilma cries out, oh my God, not the woman who died. This would be the first time Joseph is aware that Nancy didn't live. And at that point, both Joseph and Wilma cry, per the officers. So police then ask Joseph about the clothing he wore on the second. He does turn over his jacket. Additionally, they ask to see the knife. So he takes them into the garage, and he had a hiding place above a door there in the garage where he pulled out 2 knives. Now, the police are looking at the knives. I mean, they know kind of what they should be seeing. And one of the knives he pulls out is a 7-inch hunting knife, and the other one is a 14-inch butcher knife. And immediately they ask Joseph to tell them the truth about the knives, because the knives he pulls out, they're dull, they obviously haven't been used, and they don't match the description of the wounds and such. So Joseph then tells the truth. So he says after he left the Zanones, he buried the knife at the St. Mary Magdalene soccer field along his pathway home. Joseph then leads the officers to the field, and Officer Stalker digs up the knife. He leads them straight to the knife where he dug it. They bag it, and it's said that he takes the knife to the lab. Now, it's 4 p.m. on December 3rd, so Captain Walsh takes Joseph downtown to the police headquarters, and he turns him over to Sergeant Michael Kilroy on the 4th floor. And Kilroy is a juvenile officer, but he's not a representative of the circuit courts. He's a juvenile officer, I guess, under the St. Louis PD, but he's not under or paid by the actual courts. I know that's a little weird. But also there is a Quentin, I think it's Gonsler, And he is the first assistant circuit attorney for the city of St. Louis. And he takes a question and answer statement from Joseph with Kilroy and a stenographer. And then there's another assistant circuit attorney person present named Brendan Ryan. Now, Ryan notates throughout the interview, Joseph shows no feelings whatsoever. He was a perfect sociopath, quote unquote. By 9:30 p.m., Joseph is taken to the St. Louis Juvenile Court. So now it's 9 p.m., 9:30. This will be the first time he's at the juvenile court. By the next afternoon on the 4th, he finally speaks to an officer. So they just put him in. He speaks to an officer of the court named Donald Jones, and he questioned Joseph again. Joseph cries and states, yes, he knew the woman he stabbed died. So to Jones, he says that he stabbed Nancy in the chest about 2 times, and when Nancy turned away, he stabbed her again. So he has variations on what he's done. I think at one point he had said that he stabbed her in the stomach, but we do know that there was 2, we've gone over her wounds. So he just wasn't clear, and in his confessions was not very clear about his stabbing, where he wounded her. Now, he did ask about seeing his mom, and they let him know the visitation schedule and then called Wilma to let her know the visitation schedule. So Jones fills out a memorandum with the juvenile judge stating Joseph Arbeiter is involved in a violation of the law and requests Joseph be placed in juvenile detention until further orders. He would be there a month while a judge decided whether he would be tried as a juvenile or adult. Again, he's 15. So now let's do a little background on Joseph. So he is Joseph Arbeiter Jr. So he is named after his father, and his mom is Wilma, like we mentioned. Joseph's father was in military service, his whole career, pretty much, and we'll get into that a little bit. He began as a soldier in the Army. By the time he met Wilma in 1941, he had already served 8 years. The two were married in 1943, and Joseph was sent to serve in Germany during the war. His service was distinguished, but being in the war, it cost him a lot, and a lot to his family in the long run. So when he returned from Germany, he began drinking heavily. And when he drank, which was often, he was abusive. He was physically and mentally abusive to all the Arbeiters, okay? All of them. Now, they do have a first child in 1946, a girl, and then they have Joseph in 1948, all while moving around. So for Joseph Sr.'s career. So they live in Lexington, Missouri. They live in Fort Leavenworth in Kansas. It says that in 1951, they moved to Fort Benning, Georgia for Senior to go into the U.S. Army Ranger School. But before then, there was some time that they even went to Colorado for training. So they are moving around with him, okay? The family remained in Georgia while Senior was sent to Korea for the Korean War. And there, he did earn a Bronze Star and a Silver Star for his gallantry in action. So he is doing well in service. He's just not doing well at home, and he is very abusive. So after this, he is sent to Japan to Camp Crawford. By this time, there is a third child, another girl, and the whole family goes with him to Japan, okay? While there, Joseph Jr. starts kindergarten. It is said that he is a bad student and had to repeat kindergarten. I don't really know. In my head, I guess this is like the 1950s of it, but you can't be a bad student. Obviously, probably, I don't know, just not ready for kindergarten, probably, I would imagine. So, but yeah, a bad student in kindergarten. That was weird. In 1955, the family, they moved back to Lexington, Missouri, and they stay there for about a year and a half. Then Joseph is stationed in Germany, Joseph Sr., where they live there for 4 years. And during this time, the abuse and the drinking, all of it is persisting, okay? And Joseph Jr. begins showing his telltale signs of what's to come. Like he starts stealing, like he steals from family, he steals from friends, he steals from stores, and he's not going to school. Like he is truant a lot. So even though his father is a complete horrible waste of space, Joseph Jr. idolizes his father. He was even super proud of like beatings, and he was super proud of his dad's military service, but he was proud, like he would proudly display any bruises from beatings from his father to kids at school. Like he was proud. That's just totally, oh, it's sad. It's really sad. That's all I'll say to that. By 1960, Joseph was 12, and his family, and I'm just thinking 12, like so young. So they moved back to the States. So they were back in the States. First, they're living in Fort Benning in Georgia again, but then they're going to Florida, where his dad would be located at the Eglin Air Force Base there. However, they're only there for about 4 months when Wilma finds out that Joseph Sr. had been sexually molesting his 2 daughters. Evidently, Joseph Jr. knew about it, but had been threatened to not tell his mother by Joseph Sr. Now, Wilma turned Joseph Sr. in to the authorities, and it's not clear. I mean, I think it was the military authorities and not necessarily the police or whatever, but they do require Joseph Sr. to be admitted into a psychiatric hospital, and Wilma divorces him. And she does end up dropping the charges against him, so he doesn't actually have like legal issues from this. And she did this because she did not want to have her girls have to testify against him. And I totally understand that. And Wilma, I mean, bless her, she's doing what you do. Like she lived with that nightmare forever. But as soon as she found out about the sexual abuse, like she did what she needed to do. She was trying to be a very good mother. So anyway, they dropped the charges. So the kids won't testify, but she's divorced from him. And he's not legally in trouble, but the military does require him to retire. And they state that he is not allowed to re-enlist ever again. So basically they flag him. But evidently he still gets to honorably discharge, I guess. So Wilma is now on her own with 3 kids. And Joseph Jr., again, loving his horrible father. I mean, talk about daddy issues. So Joseph Jr. blames his mom and his sisters for breaking up the family and the fact that now he cannot see his dad. So he was already like on this very destructive path. And yes, this just makes him very upset, angry, frustrated, just, yeah, and pointing it at his mother and sisters, okay? So she gets the kids. She's got the kids. She moves them back to St. Louis. She has to take, a job. She has to work. So she takes the job. She takes a hard job with long hours, working in a manufacturing place. And so she cannot handle Joseph. I mean, he is horrible. He is violent and emotional. He never necessarily hits Wilma, but he does point his violence towards his sisters. And he does throw things to the point of throwing stuff at them, hitting them with glass objects, like cutting into them. I mean, they get wounds, serious wounds from what he does to them. And again, he's stealing and he won't go to school. So he's absolutely a problem. And he does, and this is coming from his dad. Again, he loves everything that his dad's into. So he has a very horrible fascination with knives. And he gets this from his father. So he would threaten his sisters with knives like all the time. And again, a lot of foreshadowing here, okay? So by 1961, Wilma takes Joe to the Family Children's Services. They evaluate him and say he is deviating substantially from the norm. so many feelings. He appears to have zero impulse control. So basically, if he feels it, he reacts. There is no, there's just no calming him down. There's no buffer. There's nothing. He has zero impulse control. They advised that Joe needed to live in a facility or foster home, that basically his female driven household was not working for him. But he does remain in his home. I'm sure that Wilma didn't want him to go into a foster home. Now now it says that this was 61. So between February and November of 1963, it said that Joseph is arrested 3 separate times for burglaries and theft. He confessed to a total of 14, and most were breaking into people's homes. Okay, so this is February to November. Now, Joseph always carried a knife. Everywhere he went, he had a knife. And people, like the kid, like he kept it hidden. He took it to school. If he went to school, he took a knife with him. And he would hide them. He would even tell the psychologist, which he saw a psychologist in 61, and we'll get into the rest. But he saw a psychologist, and he told the psychologist his name was Dirk, which is after a type of knife. So he was very fascinated with knives. So Joseph was supposed to be a freshman at Cleveland High School, and he was flunking out, but he was considered to be very bright. I mean, I guess they have the different course schedules, and he was placed in like the highest classes, I guess, based on testing, and he just refused to go. So by December 2nd, he literally hadn't been to school since the 1st of November. So for the last month, he hadn't been going to classes, and nobody really knew. Evidently, if the school was telling Wilma, it wasn't registering. So she thought he was going to school. He was not going to school. Now, I will say his home is less than 1 mile from where the Zanones live. So now Joseph is in custody with the juvenile courts, and a Judge David McMullen states, this boy should have been seen, but never was. So literally, like we mentioned, Joseph was arrested 3 times, between February and November, and he was never put in front of a judge nor evaluated again, other than what Wilma took him in 1961. Now, this situation with him murdering, Nancy has brought a horrible light to a horrible situation with the juvenile system in St. Louis, which had evidently had seen a huge spike in juvenile problems over the past few years. So evidently there were only 24, 25 juvenile officers, and they had money aligned for 29. So they're short-staffed. They have a budget for 29. However, they require these officers to have a certain amount of training, a certain amount of schooling, but yet they don't pay them well. They pay them around $5,000 a year when other states are paying $7,500 a year. So they're paying them, over $2,000 less per year. So they can't get qualified officers, and they're also not being able to retain the officers that they have. And it said that they really, for the amount of caseloads that they have, they had 24 or 25. They need 45. So they are badly understaffed. They have way too many cases, way too many juveniles, and juveniles like Joseph are literally falling through the cracks in the system. And the judge, McMullen is he should have been seen. He was never, it's he was brought in and nothing happened because they had no one to work it. So yeah, it's a horrible situation going on. So with this situation happening, the court immediately upon this happening restructures to have 10 of those officers, 10 full-time deputies, to work the most serious juvenile cases. That way to ensure that the serious offenses were put in front of a judge, like Joseph should have been. Now, this also brought to light an issue on top of all of this because Wilma, not only did she take Joseph in 61, but in January of 1962, she went back to the Family Children Services of Greater St. Louis and asked them to take over the supervision of Joseph because she couldn't do it anymore. Like she told them she just couldn't handle him. So a 4-page letter from Family Services to the juvenile court stating Joseph needed a controlled therapeutic environment. So this is sent. A psychologist said Joseph could try to stay at home, but really felt that probably wouldn't work again. And if so, he needed to be removed from his home. So this is what the psychologist is saying in 62. So they said it in 61 and they said it in 62 and nothing ever happened. And again, he is arrested, 3 times and nothing happened. So it's a problem. Back to the situation at hand, Judge McMullen has to decide on how Joseph will be tried. So under the law at the time, you could only try a juvenile as an adult if they were 14, at least 14, and had also committed an offense that would be a felony if committed by an adult, which Joseph is. He's 15, and yes, murder, definitely a felony. So the newspapers, like I mentioned, were going crazy. I mean, they're going crazy. Like this, this is a young mom of 2 small children, murdered, stabbed, left for dead in her home, like by a 15-year-old. I mean, this is, yes, the media have jumped on this. So media's all over. They stated all of this, like they're talking about him being, a juvenile being tried. So the newspapers are clearly advocating for Joseph to be tried as an adult, citing he had even stated, like evidently the newspaper said that he stated, I'm only 15. They can't do anything to me, is what they allege. And this is what they're putting out in the newspapers. So the public was out for Joseph to be made an example of. I mean, they want an example to be made. I mean, he has killed an innocent mother of 2, leaving 2 children just completely without a mother. I mean, it's heinous. You can imagine. So in 1963, public defenders did not exist. In fact, they wouldn't exist in Missouri until 1972. So attorneys were assigned when people didn't have an attorney on their own. In this case, this worked magic for Joseph. The 2 attorneys assigned came from a prominent law firm, and his first 2 attorneys, their names are a John Haley Jr. and a James Ferguson. So, and they come from a very large firm or very good firm with good attorneys. So, in a closed hearing on December 30th, 1963, McMullen rules that Joseph is not a proper subject to be dealt with under provision of juvenile code and would be tried as an adult. The judge's decision cited several reasons: nature of crime, psychological, psychiatric, and social investigation input, humane provision and procedure of Missouri New Mental Responsibility Act, and limitation under the juvenile courts. So this new Mental Responsibility Act would come into play big time, and this act had only been in law for 2 months. So it was but under this, so there were several things under this, but it said under this new law, a person is not responsible for criminal acts if the person is deemed incapable of conforming his conduct to the requirement of the law. And there were a lot more items, and that's conforming, incapable of conforming his conduct to the requirement of law. I mean, I don't know if this law in Missouri still exists or if it's been modified or whatever. Like, this hits wrong for me. So Joseph is officially indicted by a grand jury on January 16th of 1964. He is charged with murder in the Nancy Zanone case, but also assault with intent to rob in the Grace Munyon case. So he's going to have 2 different situations, okay? On October 27th, 1964, so Joseph goes on trial for Nancy's death in October. And so this is almost a full year later. However, 2 days into the trial, Sergeant Feldmeyer mentions the Grace Munyon assault in his testimony. Joseph's bright attorney, Mr. Haley Jr., moved for mistrial. The judge, which is a Casey Walsh, agrees, ruling that a higher court would state it is a reversible error to have any crime other than the one at issue be mentioned. So immediately, mistrial. Okay, this is October 1964. 2 days in. This is how it's going. So with the first trial, a complete bust for the state. So Joseph's retrial on Nancy's case begins 6 weeks later on December 7th of 1964. So a new judge named David Murphy would be on this trial. On the other trial, the defense had won a motion stating none of Joseph's statements to the police before his mother was present would be admissible. So the defense wanted to do the same now. Well, Judge Murphy didn't agree. So basically, he would allow all the statements to be heard. Now the defense also requested for a pushback of the trial because on December 1st, an article had come out in the newspaper about how Joseph was also awaiting trial for Grace Munyon. And in that article, it stated about his admissions of killing Nancy with a knife and such. So the defense argued that there could be absolutely no fair trial with the article being out just 6 days before. So the judge denied this. It's like, no, sorry. So now the defense still had some other requests. They wanted the jury sequestered because of all the media attention. They didn't want jurors going home and hearing about the case on the radio or TV or picking up in the newspapers. And I completely understand. I get that. So also the defense didn't want any mention about Nancy's children. They didn't want the jury to know she had 2 small children because it would be prejudicial. So the judge did agree to that. So judge is saying yes to the sequestering, and then no mention of Nancy's children. So the trial begins. Feldmeyer is back on the stand and mentions about Joseph's statement of going door-to-door knocking on the second, having in mind burglary. The defense objects and asks for another mistrial because of mention of burglarizing. The judge overrules this. So the judge is like, no. But the judge does ask the jury to disregard the statement. Now, the officer Keaty takes the stand and he mentions something about lots of pictures hanging on the walls in the children's bedroom. So the defense objects, asking for another mistrial. But Officer Keaty hadn't been one of the witnesses that the judge had instructed not to mention the children. He had only mentioned that because Dawn Zanone and Betty the neighbor, they were going to be witnesses. So the judge overruled the defense on this one. The defense really in this trial, their focus was on all the psychologists and psychiatrists that saw Joseph from 61, the one that saw him at 61, 62, and then after the murders happened, he had a lot of evaluations in 63. Obviously, their push was for Joseph to be declared incapable mentally from being able to control his actions, and thus couldn't be held accountable for the murder. I have so many feelings on that. But anyway, moving forward. So a Dr. Rosenberg, who was utilized after the murder, said that Joseph had gross misperception of women in the terms of potential danger inherent in women to the degree in which he might be seriously scared or even devoured by women. He felt like that. I'm like, okay. He would also go on to say Joseph's perception of women as extraordinarily aggressive and potentially is seen as aggressive, cold, rigid individuals. So he just thinks that, Joseph has this view of women. Okay. So this is why when he encountered Nancy Zanone in her home that he broke into, Joseph saw in that situation a threat to his existence and thus killed her. Again, I don't have words. Now, another psychiatrist named Dr. John Bergman, he stated along the lines of Rosenberg. However, he added in a statement that I don't think Joseph was out to simply burglarize a home. I think this boy was unconsciously, if you please, driven to kill a woman. So he says this psychiatrist, which I totally 100% agree with, but that's from the view that I have, knowing the whole story. So, and of course, these people don't know about grace. So they don't, and to me, I'm sorry, I understand the point of not bringing in another case that's not tried. Okay, I do understand it because Grace, he has not been tried and convicted of that. That's an indictment, but like there is a pattern and he confessed. I mean, there's not, in this situation, there's not like a question of innocence. It's a why, but not a question of did he do this. Anyway, this there's just so much wrong with the whole situation, I guess. I don't know. So many thoughts. So, yeah. So both the defense and prosecution, they go back and forth with different witnesses and experts in psychology, and the defense bottom line was two things. They felt the statements by Joseph, which led to the evidence of the knife in his jacket, were gotten illegally, and then second, that he wasn't mentally sound. So the prosecution psychiatrist stated, yes, okay, he has emotional issues, but he is mentally sound. After 4 days of testimony, the case is turned over to the jury, and they had options. So they have first-degree murder option, they have second-degree murder option, or they have not guilty on, reason of mental incapacity, which would mean, Joseph would be turned over to state hospital until they felt he was okay mentally to no longer be a danger to society. And a little tidbit. So the whole Miranda law thing it's not a thing. It's not like it's not gone through. It is happening kind of at this same time in 1963. Okay, so that whole thing is not a thing yet. Just know that. In fact, the Miranda assailants, their own trial is in 63. So, yeah. So the defense does try to bring up like, okay, so he wasn't read his rights, but that's really not a requirement at the time that he was arrested. So, long story short, it's like it's on people's mind because they're going through it at that time, but it's not a thing. So the jury took 3 hours to deliberate, and at 5:34 p.m. on December 11th, 1964, the jury came back with guilty in first degree and the sentence of life in prison. And Joseph is now 16, and he is facing a guilty first-degree murder charge and a life in prison. So his attorneys, very bright, prominent attorneys, immediately filed for an appeal, but the judge denies the appeal. And then in February of 1965, the attorneys vowed to take this issue to the Missouri Supreme Court based on the grounds that Joseph was not advised of his constitutional rights at the time he made a formal confession, and that the statement there should not have been admitted as evidence in the trial. So on October 10th, 1966, so we're like 3 years, past, the Missouri Supreme Court reverses Joseph's first-degree murder conviction, citing the defendant was not prior to making such statement, i.e. confessing to police that he stabbed Nancy, advised of his rights to remain silent, to legal advice or advice from a competent adult, and not furnish such. And that was violation of his right under the Juvenile Code for Missouri, in violation of his 5th, 6th, and 14th Amendment rights under the Constitution. So basically, the fact that they did not get him to the juvenile court first is the issue. Now, again, Miranda rights did not go into effect until 1966. However, he did, this is a big to-do. Joseph wasn't immediately directly taken before the juvenile court, or delivered to the juvenile officer or person acting for him. So, and this was required at the time of his arrest, that was required in the Missouri statute, but the police were just continuing to kind of do their policy, which they really shouldn't have been doing. So they were kind of going rogue, and when they went rogue, that's when it was like, no, you should have back it up. So for the past 2 years, poor Don and Nancy's family and friends, they've just been living in a fog. I mean, it's just, a horrible, sad situation. Now with the conviction overturned, on Joseph, the fog turns into a storm, a horrible storm. It was like they're starting back at square one. It gave them a little bit of peace that Joseph was convicted, or, at least when he was on trial, and then he had a conviction and he's in jail. And now it looks, it's been overturned. So it's just like starting at square one. And during this time, Don and the kids, they moved in with his parents, and the kids were very sheltered in a very loving environment with Don's parents. And they did not talk. We talked about this. They did not talk about the murder, and, and really being with the grandparents did give them a big sense of comfort and warmth. So that's kind of where they're at. As for the juvenile system in Missouri, so this decision made them have to fully change their policies and actually adhere to making sure to take the juveniles directly to the juvenile court. It also made prosecution want better training in law enforcement, that they needed not to only depend on confessions so much in crimes. That was becoming an issue. They needed to do better police work so that if the confession wasn't necessarily needed in order to get a conviction. So there's lots of changes being made because of this case. Okay, this case is, just like the Miranda case, it is very important. At least, in Missouri state law, it is shaking things up, especially for how they treat juveniles and crimes. So Joseph's retrial was at first scheduled for January 23rd, 1967. Joseph had been in a state penitentiary, but was moved back to St. Louis City Jail. So the defense motions to suppress Joseph's confession, of course, which was signed on by the judge. However, the state motion for Joseph's statements made to the juvenile court to be admissible as being relevant and material, and also an exception to the hearsay rule. This would turn into a battle, ending with Judge Franklin Reagan getting all of the juvenile records. Obviously, the defense files a motion that, opening such records would be a violation of sundry constitutional rights of the juvenile, including due process, the prohibition against self-incrimination, and the right to counsel. All of this fighting went back and forth before the Missouri Supreme Court, which finally ruled in April of 1968 that the records must be turned over to the circuit court. One judge dissented, which was a Robert Saylor. So they fought, and they did. The Missouri Supreme Court came back and said, yes, turn the records over to, just remember, they said to turn the records over. So the media reaction to such was mixed. So some were, they're just upset. They're upset that this murderer, his conviction was overturned. They're upset about that. So they just want him to pay for what he did. They were happy when he was convicted. But there were a few that were like, okay, now you're going to get into these records. But more over not, they were just wanting Joseph to be in trouble. So now the trial is July 31st, 1968. The state this time went after murder in the second degree, being that Joseph's incriminating statements to police are banned. So the differences in this trial, obviously, they couldn't mention about the knife because it was evidence that came forth before Joseph was in juvenile custody. But the judge did allow this time the state to mention the children being at the scene, which was what was not permitted last time. So, yeah, so you kind of have a yin and a yang on what was the same, what was different. Essentially, the same witnesses testified and the same defense objections came forward. This trial lasted 3 days. At the end of the third day, the jury had their verdict by 3:25 p.m., guilty of second-degree murder, sentencing to 40 years in prison. Joseph was returned to the state penitentiary in Jefferson City while the defense again got ready to take the appeal to Missouri Supreme Court. So, you've had 3 trials, the first one being a mistrial, the second one being a conviction, very quickly convicted, first degree, and now you have this third trial on Nancy, for Nancy, and he is convicted, and they, right away give him the highest sentence, probably the highest that they can on both. I mean, it's pretty clear that the juries are like, yes, you're guilty. So now, between all this going on in the justice situation for Nancy's death, Nancy's kids, they're still living. I mean, they're out there living their lives, and they're missing their mother. They love their life with their grandparents. Since the murder, there was always, you can imagine, because of this happening, there was a huge, big sense of safety, naturally. Always very cautious. Always everybody talking about locking the doors. Now, Don does meet a woman, and he remarries by July 1967. She would be a good wife, but not necessarily a good stepmother. She already had children, and she kind of evidently showed favor to her children over Don's children. Now, her mother, the kid's step-grandmother in Minnesota, was always super kind to them. And actually, they were supposed to visit this step-grandmother in the summer of 1968, but the kids didn't get to go. And of course, they don't know anything. They're not told anything about anything. They're not told about Joseph. They're not told about the courts. They're not told about any of this mess going on. So they have no clue, but obviously that trip was postponed because, Dawn is a witness in the trial. So they didn't know, but the retrial was happening. So, yeah. So fast forward, now it's January 12th, 1970. So the Missouri Supreme Court comes back and overturns Joseph's second-degree murder conviction. This time, the main finding being that it was unfair to obtain an admission of a juvenile in the non-adversarial atmosphere of the juvenile court and then use that admission against the juvenile in an adversarial criminal proceeding. After this ruling, the Missouri General Assembly amended the juvenile code to match up with this ruling, making it inadmissible in criminal proceedings all admissions, confessions, and statements by the child to the juvenile officer. So, Missouri, hello, okay, they took the question of allowing the records be turned over to the circuit court. They took that question to you, and you said okay. But now you come back and say this, and then the General Assembly has to because obviously that wasn't in the juvenile code. So this is brand new. This is just you doing your thing. I'm like, really? Really? This is frustrating. It's just, I can only imagine the state's frustration over this, the Zanone's frustration, and Joseph's just sitting back like, yeah, I'm only 15. What are you going to do about it? How absolutely frustrating. So, moving forward. With this ruling, Joseph Arbeiter would be set free. As the state lacked admissible evidence, the newspapers call for juvenile reform. They're mad. Everybody's mad. They're like, I'm mad. Everybody's mad. So they're stating that, a person is being set free, not because they're innocent, but because they were 15 at the time of the slaying. And the words by Joseph then, I'm only 15 years old, they cannot do anything to me, have tragically been proven accurate, like his statements. So the freeing of Joseph is slammed by the media. Headlines run, Arbeiter Case mocks justice. So this is the feeling. This is This is the community. These are the people. This is how they're feeling. And they're feeling like you can just go murder an innocent woman, an innocent young woman in her home. And because you're 15, even though a judge came forward and said, we're going to try you, and the law said, okay, if you're 14 and above and you commit something bad enough that it's a felony, you should be treated as an adult. No, Missouri Supreme Court, they go out on their own. So anyway, moving forward, it's frustrating. Everybody's it's shameful. So I agree. I feel their disgust, their shame. One editorial read, "The law should be for the protection of those who abide by it. When confessed killers, because of their age, are able to use the legal technicalities as a shield from prosecution for violating the law, justice has broken down. The Arbeiter case is a sickly comment on current social values." So again, people are sickened, they're grossed out, they're mad, they're like, this is injustice. And of course, this is most felt by Nancy's family, her poor family. They're absolutely devastated. How can this happen? How can a confessed killer of their mother, wife, daughter, sister be set free? Like they don't know what to think. They're in shock. In the wake of her devastation, Joan, Nancy's sister, formed an organization with a friend, Jane, called ACT, A Challenge Today. Purpose was to do exactly what the newspaper editorials called for: move forward with changes in Missouri's juvenile code and increase the safety for the citizens. So they first made ACT like buttons. They put out the buttons to wear for people. They spoke to groups in St. Louis about the issues. They had petition drives, and they were seeking, of course, to change. They're just hoping to change the code. They're hoping to change the law. They work for 18 months straight. They do lobby. They end up, going all over the state, going into Jefferson City, the capital, and they were on their way. They were doing so good. They had some like juvenile reform codes, and they had some bills in place, and they thought they were going to pass, but they didn't. So after 18 months, Joan is like pregnant again, I believe with like her fourth child, I believe. And, all her children can say from what they remember during this time is like, they really admired her. Like they admired their mom for fighting for something that she believed in and fighting to right the wrong that happened to Nancy. So, and that happened to their family. So anyway, they didn't necessarily get their, legislation passed then. I really, and I don't know, if you know about Missouri state law and the juvenile code now, or how that's going, let me know. I don't know. So I know this case probably brought about a lot of change, and hopefully good change, and hopefully a situation, because you're going to see this is a lifelong problem. So, I mean, yeah. As for Joseph, moving forward, when he is released, he is now 21 years old. Not even 6 months out of prison, on July 16th, 1970, he is indicted on a rape charge of a 21-year-old woman in St. Louis, where allegedly he had gone to a party at her home. Then he returned later and raped her. He threatened her to not go to the authorities about it. He then returned to her home on the 30th with a gun, still threatening her. And then she went to the authorities because he literally shot the gun into her home when she wouldn't let him in the house. So, at his trial, Joseph's defense produces a witness that said that he was with her in a town meeting her parents 3 hours from St. Louis. So basically saying, there's no way he could do this because he was with me meeting my parents, and then her parents corroborated this story, so the jury found Joseph not guilty. I don't think anyone believes anything, and you'll see why as we progress. So he would be in trouble again. In June 1971, he stole a knife and a cigarette lighter. And these were reported. So a knife and a cigarette lighter were reported stolen. And then a car. So all of these things were reported stolen the same day. Well, detectives witnessed him driving around in this car that was reported stolen. And then when they pull him over, they find the other stolen items with him. So he is charged with second-degree burglary and operating a motor vehicle without the owner's permission. His defense asked for a change of venue since the city of St. Louis was quote-unquote against him. I mean, well, yeah, he's a convicted murderer who's out, raping people and then, doing all this other. He turns around, pleads guilty. He receives, this is kind of weird, he received 6 years total, but it was kind of broken down with the charges a little differently, and the paperwork wasn't great. So he ends up serving 3 years. So, yeah. So it's supposed to be like 6, but the breakdown was supposed to be like 4 and 2, but then they couldn't determine in the paperwork if it was consecutive or concurrent. So he got off early. So now it's 1974. He is out on, September 14th, 1974. It is alleged that he enters a bar called the Artesian Lounge. The tavern owner's name is Louis Jack Hasty, and he gets shot and killed by a masked individual. And then a woman who, I guess she was in the bathroom, and then she comes out, she gets sexually assaulted. And then Joseph is arrested for this crime. Now, his trial is moved from the city, so they move it from the city. The police had a fingerprint match for him, and then they did try to take hair samples to match from him to hairs found on the ski mask used and was left, so that the evidence. He is tried January 14th, 1976, and he is found not guilty. The jury deliberated evidently 30 minutes or so and found him not guilty. After this situation, Joseph is actually not involved with the law for like a few years. So, in 1978, he gets married to a woman named Shirley Newcomb. In 1979, he gets in trouble for like a really small burglary deal, like literally steals candy from a Quick Way Foods. And the bond is like $35, and so he bails out. On August 15th, 1981, Joseph would be arrested for 4 counts of possession of a controlled subject. Now, his bond is set at $15,000. He does eventually bail out, like not right away, but he does. Before his trial, evidently it comes out that at trial, he planned to have his mother-in-law smuggle him in some guns, and then he was going to kill the judge because he was not going back to prison. That was his words. So the judge is learning of all this going on. Evidently, this is like being told from several different situations. The judge gets all kinds of protection, and he does withdraw the bond, throwing Joseph back in jail until the trial. Now, lo and behold, Joseph, who is incapable of getting a guilty sentence. Now, he is found not guilty for part of these counts, okay? Part of them. I mean, they find these drugs, like they had been watching him. They found out that he was dealing drugs. It came to their attention, to the police attention, that he was dealing some drugs. They watch him they're like surveying him, whatever. They find these drugs in his home, in his room. I mean, anyhow. But but these juries, I don't even know what's going on. But I don't know if it's prosecution. Like, is this faulty prosecution or faulty jurists? Who knows? But anyway, maybe they don't all understand. But anyway, something is faulty. But they do actually get him on 1 count. So he is found guilty. The judge, knowing all of this background, gives him the maximum sentence that he can of 10 years. And the jury's shocked because, for one, the jury doesn't get to sentence him. I guess the judge is like, no, you're not doing it. I'm doing it. But the jury doesn't know. They don't know his history. They don't know about all of the stuff that he's done before. They don't know about him threatening the judge. Like, they don't know any of these things. They're completely in the dark, which is why the judge is like, nope, I'm sentencing this fool. So, he is sentenced to 10 years. 10 years. Finally, okay? So although he tries to appeal his conviction, it actually doesn't work, which is shocking because, I mean, he's just the luckiest loser ever. But he is actually in prison for the 10 years. So he is out on, probation in 1992. However, he violates his parole. I don't know how or why, but he is back in prison from 94 to 2002. So that's actually awesome for anyone living in the St. Louis area. So once out in 2002, he does move away from St. Louis and to Sedalia, Missouri. Sedalia, I think it's called that, about 90 miles east of Kansas City. Now, for about 6 years, he is out of prison until he gets arrested for possession of marijuana in 2008. Now, he is 60 years old. The judge goes ahead and puts him just on probation, kind of suspends his sentence. He's like, it's possession of marijuana. You're 60. So he's on parole. So he makes it through, or probation. He makes it through the probation. But on November 28th of 2010, he's driving around without a license, and he's done this before. He has an accident while he's doing this and flees the scene. And this, of course, is a felony. So he's arrested, and then in May 2011, he pleads guilty to the charges. And he's sentenced to 4 years in prison at that time, but the judge still suspends his sentence and gives him 5 years probation instead. So he's still not incarcerated, okay? Okay. Unfortunately not, because this is what he does. So, yeah. April 30th of 2014, he is arrested for allegedly raping a neighbor in the trailer park he's living in. While he was in custody from this situation, like maintenance workers for the trailer park start like getting his trailer ready for another renter when they find a metal box with 2 human arms inside. Yes. The authorities are called in, and after more searching, additional remains are found in shallow grave near his trailer. So he does confess to killing a woman he says he only knew her as Mandy. And evidently she lived or was connected with people in the trailer park where he lived. So it was estimated that he killed her in like January of 2014. And then he says he dismembered her to conceal the crime. Now, this victim is a Mandy Black, 35-year-old from Marshall, Missouri. And she was literally a mother of 4 and only 35 years old. Does this sound familiar? I mean, does he have a pattern of awfulness, evil? Yes, he's a monster, and he's just atrocious. So now, because of this murder, the media are reaching out to Dawn. So Dawn urges Laura and David to not talk to the press. Like, Dawn doesn't talk to the press. He urges them not to comment. Because Joseph pleads guilty, like, he's going to get a life sentence instead of the state going for the death penalty. Now, Laura and David decide to reach out to the prosecutor, and they attend this trial on, like, Mandy's trial. They had never come face to face with Joseph. They were never told much about it. They're having to figure things out as adults and whatnot. So now all they see is just this old drugged out man. And so now they're literally coming face to face with this man. They just know his name. They just know he's a monster and that he killed their mother. Like, he killed their mother. So Joseph he goes to prison. He is sentenced at Crossroads Correctional Center in Cameron, Missouri. He does die of natural causes in prison on June 20th of 2015. Dawn passes away in October of 21. And it looks like Laura and David, living their lives. They have kids, grandkids. They're blessed. And Joseph, who went by Joe, did horrible things for a lifetime. And the justice system continually enabled him to do so. And, I mean, come on. Like, there's no telling what else he did that no one knows about. I mean, these are just the things that they know about. Just the things. So there really is a problem when the law is protecting people that are clearly, I know that that some people are arrested and that they're innocent. Yes. This was not a question of innocence. Ever. Ever. There was not a question. He knew. Everybody knew he was guilty. And yet he was allowed to do things over and over. And that is a problem. That is a problem with her. That is what needs to be fixed in our system. And I hate to say it, just some common sense needs to be used when we are putting laws into place. Unfortunately, I know that comes down and is prejudicial or whatever, and everybody has their own idea on that. But this is madness. It's just madness. Anyway, it's frustrating. So this is a sad, frustrating case, but I'm going to remember Nancy. I'm going to remember that she was an amazing dancer, an amazing singer, and she was an avid reader, and she was a pursuer and conqueror of all of her dreams and her husband and her kids. And she was an amazing sister, and she was awesome. I'm done with Joseph. I'll remember Nancy. So anyway, I hope that you will go hug your family members. And I am going to. So a lot of this research is based on a very good book written by someone associated with a family. And it is a very good read. So I, of course, will always post my reference. So I will post my reference. But thanks for listening and love you guys. And hug your family and let's reform some laws.